So the modern academic discipline of history stands in contrast with the aims and modes of the great books tradition. Sometimes so much that the great books programs attract criticism that they don't really do history, or at least don't do it right. Our goal today is to pass on a vision for a radical history that is not beholden to the norms and expectations of academic history, but gets at the root of what humans need and desire from looking to the past.
The key tension that we are seeing here between academic history and the Great Books projects is what we're going to start off by calling the problem of accounts. And these are kind of a quick overview of some of the things that we hear from colleagues, from other people, that are basically ways of substantiating the claim that great books don't do history. And the first one is it's a reliability issue. Great books can't deliver a reliable, factual account of the past. There's just too few of them. There's too little. They're too narrow in that sense. So they have a narrow scope. Not only that in terms of what they're delivering in terms of the past, but even the book itself is not even giving you enough to deal with the book. So in order to really read Plato, really read Aristotle, really read Bronte, well, you need more contextual knowledge to even do that right. So we've often heard that the objection that great book students don't have enough contextual knowledge to even understand the book, let alone the culture that it's in. And also there's a third one is that great books programs can inculcate a real naivete, that students start making these broad generalizations off of a sort of like naive uptake of homework that they now understand something that they call Greek culture. Which is already mixed with Homer, who's already looking, is describing something prior to him, et cetera. So the idea is that, well, when you're looking to make accounts, great books don't give you an opportunity to do that, and moreover, they reinforce a sense of broad generalizations and naivete about history. And the common assumption behind all three of these is that history, what counts as history, is an accurate recovery of an account of a past event or culture. So history is about accounts, the right sort of accounts, and great books can't deliver those kinds of accounts, and therefore they just don't do history.
Right, so what's more, the problem of accounts bleeds into and is reinforced by an assessment definition of what really counts as success. So we have goals, right? Students must master expert accounts of the past for learning to count, right? So it's memorize, it's regurgitate, it's recount the arguments or consensus between historians, right? Kind of understand a historical taxonomy. That's the goal. The mode, for example, is to be able to what? Say something like Susan Weisbauer's read earlier, which is Bacon's rebellion came about because of a change of oppression in Virginia. Right? So you talk about events happening, leading to other events that lead to other events. You've got to be able to recount those to actually be saying you're doing history. And then the nature of the account is causal. It's thick. The more information, the more complexity that you can bring to the conversation from outside evidence, the better it is. Epidictic, I can never say that word, which is like assessing the blame or praising the thing that happened. Making sure that you're historically literate, like you need to know about certain things to be historically literate. Those are just some of the pieces that we're always wrestling with when we're reading great texts. We're not doing those things. And then they're like, well, what is it then that we can assess? So the concern here is that the Great Books Project will be thought of as a underserved or students will be thought of as underserved or historically illiterate if they can't produce the kind of account that's up here. Current assessment trends aim at this in order to avoid a chaotic, grab bag approach to teaching history, where the ends are ripe for politicization by whatever local powers that be, whose role it is to sift and represent these expert accounts. This is the problem of accounts. By another name and its goal, mode, and nature are entirely dictated by the shared assumption that history is centrally about the recovery of an accurate account of past events or cultures. And we dispute not only the narrowness, but ultimately the efficacy of this approach. It treats something ancillary and necessary as if it's the most central thing.
Well, let's say a quick caveat here. There is great value in sharing accounts of the past. Oh, I'm supposed to take that.
You are.
There is great value. It's not supposed to be loud. It's just for the tape. Yeah, I know. It feels very much like a gesture towards recording. There's great value in sharing accounts of the past together. We're not disputing that, but we're saying that there's a greater value in encountering it too. And doing this through great books is highly efficient and less encumbered by contemporary discourses and alien priorities. So rich, primary great books, we're saying, are the only things that root accounts in what could really count as a real human relevance. This is partly because these books are not merely giving accounts of what happened. Even great books that are doing history, Plutarch, Thucydides, Eusebius, are doing more than that. And we wanted to explore that for a moment just with a concrete example. And here is Thucydides. I would like to start to persuade you to consider Thucydides as a radical historian in the way that we're trying to advocate for and describe. Every reader of Thucydides accounts on the face of the text, the moment you start reading, a central question. Why read about hoplite warfare, ancient sea battles, and long-dead bickering alliances? What does this, as this is not really what Thucydides is doing, but the Chigi vase, but it's kind of a nice stand-in. What does this have to do with anything that I care about? What do any of these things have to do with something that Thucydides might want to say or tell me? Now, this is not I think we hear these kinds of questions, like what's in it for me? What's the relevance? And I think we sometimes take that as a lazy question or a way that's just trying to fob off work or interest or investment. Yeah, sometimes it is a lazy question.
That's just a lazy question.
But it's actually quite a serious question, both historically and philosophically. And it can't be quickly answered with a platitude that we have to learn from the past so that we won't repeat it. I think we already saw today how that's actually a whole notion of history that's coming in to kind of rescue us from history. We're better off coming to grips with this serious question, starting off by actually reading Thucydides. Why does this matter? It's a question, even when you pose it, you're already standing outside of Thucydides and looking at him as if you're an observer separate from him. You're standing outside the past and judging its relevance by some set of prior criteria that you're either holding consciously or unconsciously. Now, this is even more naive than engaging with a great book without sufficient contextual knowledge. You know, you can be woefully unequipped to read Thucydides, and we know that you can because we've watched people be woefully unequipped to read Thucydides, but you can do that and still gain a ton. So in that sense, these things, when you start to confront Thucydides, you begin to even ask the question in the right way. So the causes and the progress of the Peloponnesian War, those are really interesting on their own terms, but Thucydides claims his work is a monument designed to last forever. And part of the way he grounds this claim is he says, human nature being what it is. He wasn't interested in just understanding this war, but in understanding war in general. And in that sense, Thucydides' work is not just a first of its kind, and that's usually why it's taught. Oh, he's the first one to do this. But a great book because he's a man in both action and contemplation. He thinks about war, not just reports it. He contemplates the logic of war, the theory of war, human motivation, psychology, power, justice, how policies affect people's moral behavior, how humans behave under stress and fear, moral philosophy, political philosophy. These are all part of his concerns. And as a result, his work invites contemplation precisely in the artful account and not sort of standing outside of it or just jumping off of it and leaving it. It's in the details that you're supposed to be contemplating. Giving our most careful attention to his work on his own terms, not on ours, gives us more than a long dead past. For his own terms are rife with reflection and insight about something more than just a sequence of events. When we read and discuss Thucydides the humanist, freed from any pressure, outside pressure that we bring in to master a test of accounts, we can adopt something like a dialectic expectation that makes it possible for his questions to start to become our own. So one of the ways I posed this last semester in a lecture was getting the students to say, okay, should you be in love with the greatness of your own country? Do all patriots want to keep Athens great? The moment you put it that way, you think, oh, it's relevant. But it was cheating too. There's a sense in which I cheated in a sense of the relevance just with the wording. But they found that when they started looking at Pericles' speech about the greatness of Athens, how you should feel about it, that sort of the whole contemporary political climate about America being great receded enough that they could give themselves to this question in a radically new way that they'd never done before.
What we're saying too is it harmonizes with their own experiences.
Yeah, well, yeah, but by disharmonizing with it as well.
Right.
So we find ourselves, by giving ourselves to the work of Thucydides, starting to care deeply, not about my translation of his questions, but his questions. Yeah. And even coming to start to truly ask his questions for me, like myself, in a way that delivers more than just particular facts about ancient Athens. And our historical distance from him actually is really helpful. It powerfully works against immediately our narcissistic inclination to like immediately go to how does this relate to Make America Great Again. The distance, if you do it right, if you engage it in the right way, it still is preserved, and it works against our narcissism, and therefore we don't also start importing the answers we already have to our contemporary questions as if they're Thucydides. So even in engaging with his question, we allow ourselves to leave behind the first platitudinous answer in our mind through the distance, because we feel ourselves bridging the gap across that distance. And that, in that sense, a sense of alienation in the otherness of Thucydides allows us to contemplate a war, not just a war, but war alongside him. So he's a radical historian.
Right. So Thucydides is a radical historian because his great book enables us to encounter the roots, that is, the primary and permanent things that consume human life, not transitory things. He aims at giving us an account of what it means, of what has been, and he does this by contemplating it, not just by documenting it, right? Contemplating it versus documenting it. Only in such a way could he expect that it would be a work for all times and all places. So the primary mode of history turns to the roots. And by this, we don't simply mean the root cases, but the things themselves and their operations. For the things themselves comprise the only real connection that exists between past and present. The academic mode of history sometimes judges and forecloses on our projects because of the History Guild's expectations. But all guilds are post hoc enterprises with respect to what they study. That is, they come after the root things themselves and serve the things to immerse students in the ancillary disciplines of history without helping them to dialectically encounter the things in themselves is to fail to educate them in history in ways that really deeply matter. History aims at answers, and we aim first to make the questions our own. And this is fundamentally what changes the nature of the encounter with history.
So the way we tried to schematize this briefly is just here, by contrasting the difference between making an account by means of primary sources. And primary sources, you can play with that definition as much as you like, narrow, wide, but the result is an account. And a radical history that we're trying to propose to you here is one in which you encounter things in themselves dialectically by means of sources, primary, whatever. And we want to sort of propose that this is not naive, but principled. We don't pretend that we think we can really talk to Plato and find out what he believed or felt, or even like completely sketch out the contemporary context to which he might be giving a nod or responding to. But we do say that his work is so rich and coherent and compelling on its own that when you engage it deeply, you can turn alongside Plato and share with him an object of inquiry in a dialectical sense. And again, this is not just a problem for the past. It's also a problem for any time you're talking to a human. How it is that we're talking about the same thing.
You really mean with them, right?
Yes, alongside. You turn alongside with them and try to account and look towards the same object. So this is not just about the past. It's not, in that sense, it's not only legitimate, but it's necessary to engage history at all, because this is how we share things with humans, period, dialectically. And what we're attempting to do here is to, again, go to the root, the radix, the thing itself, as our main point of access to history, because that's the main point of access to humans. So one way we've sort of launched off of this with something by Gadamer. To understand a question means to ask it. To understand meaning is to understand it as the answer to a question. That is, to understand meaning, we have to realize that it's the answer to a question, an answer to a question. Until we truly share the question, how could we say we've answered it? We've talked at it. We haven't answered it until we've shared it, until we truly share it. Our pedagogy is historical insofar as we understand meaning in this way, as to be an answer to a question that we have to come to truly be asking for ourselves. And that's the core of a dialectical encounter with the past and the present.
Right, so we think the great books are the best means by which we encounter the past in this way. And they work far better than mere accounts, because they merit a deeper, more profound kind of attention. And here are some of the things that we think that sort of establishes great books. And that is that they're self-sufficient, right? These texts provide you with information you need, all the information you need to be able to understand them. They are self-contained pieces, right? They are intercanonical. That is, they are talking to each other, about each other, without merely echoing each other or rejecting each other superficially, or talking past each other with triviality, right? So they are within the flow of the great conversation. They are aware of people that have come before them. They are thinking that way. They may not directly identify them, but they are thinking about the great questions about what does it mean to be human? How do we get at these ideas? What has historically come before me?
Part of the point here is that they're always already doing it dialectically.
Right. Right.
That other doesn't have to be there for the dialectic to be staged, even in the book itself.
We also think that these texts are inexhaustible. That is, the books have a deep well of wisdom. And it continues as we return to it over and over again, actually becoming more rich and complex the more we have engagement with them. I don't know if you've ever been reading a book in class, you're working with some students, and you have an epiphany in the middle of class, like, oh my gosh, this is the thing that's happening. And your students are looking at you and you're like, what? I'm still trying to figure out like the first layer, and you're like 6 down, and you kind of have to back out. But it's because your engagement with the text has returned to you in ways you couldn't even imagine at the time. And then all of a sudden, it pops up in a way you would have never seen before. Yeah, we can. Sure. So it demands a ton to us. That is, it evokes desires, and then it makes us do something with them. Right? Desires are necessary conditions. Like, I have to satiate myself when I'm thirsty. At some point, if I don't, I die. Right? And if I actually satiate myself with the wrong thing, like salt water, I die, right? So it's actually pointed towards the right kind of return, and it's calling you, it's grabbing you, it's saying, no, you must contend with this idea.
It doesn't even if you hate it. So it
Right.
you, it makes you do something with it. That's one of the signs of a great book.
Right, so Augustine says something like, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. The question is, now what are you going to do with that? Right? The question is, if Aristotle's claim in Nick Ethics that good is what everyone seeks, now it's about contending with that, right? So these writers are attempting to say things that they believe are true and that demand your attention.
And again, that's a dialectical move. It's a demand that you come over here, and we're gonna put our attention in the similar direction.
Right. And then we were trying to, so Di and I wrote this together, and we were having long conversations, and so we came up with narcissist resistant. I don't know how else to talk about it. I like it that way. So let me quote Gadamer again. It is the essence of our reason and our spirit to be capable of thinking against what is to our own advantage, to be able to detach ourselves from our needs and interest and to bind ourselves to the law of reality. We think that's what these texts are doing. They're not just about me, right? Fred Lawrence says this about Gadamer. He says, by reason, we have the capability to acknowledge reality even against our own self-interest. And that's what you're coming in contact with, right? It's to be taught even against our own subjectively certain convictions. That is the way of mediation of authentically historical truth.
This is not just pure modernism either. It's not that, get in this slide too. It's not that I can be objective and neutral and take that stance. It's I'm holding myself against the dialectical move. I'm holding myself against myself to some degree. I am capable of acknowledging against myself is the dialectical invitation. So again, it's not a mere rehearsal of modernism, although obviously Gadamer's in that, and that's responding to that stream as German, of course. We're not describing here a set of conditions that define what makes a great book, but a set of experiences that testify to just such a thing, just such a text. What holds all these features in common is their mutually reinforcing capability for dialectic, both in the reading of the text and in the conversations that we would have in and about them. So we wanted to say that great books, they're really good at staging and rooting these kinds of encounters, real encounters, but they don't do this by themselves. You can't just pop a great book in someone and hope for the best. They're not the object of inquiry themselves, but the way that we orient together with others towards something, the deepest objects of concern that we all share, even though we share them with difference. Engaging with this way requires a pedagogy that aims at these encounters, these kinds of encounters. And in the remaining time, which is about 30 seconds, we're going to describe this as much as we can. Maybe the thing to say here is the aim is to encounter things, not just the past or authors or even books. I'm not aiming to encounter the Republic. I'm trying to encounter with Plato something he's talking about in the Republic.
Yeah, so, so when we talk about things like...
I don't know how to do this part fast.
It really is the turning of our conversation and therefore ourselves around a shared object of inquiry, right? A thing that which we all need to come to grips with. By continually returning to a question like, but what is it? It's a means of mutual orientation towards a shared object of inquiry combined with a refusal to be satisfied with a trite answer before the question is even understood, right? Students just want to answer, they want to move on. We're like, no, that is not sufficient. If you think in the first 5 minutes of class you've done this and let's move on to the next thing, you really are missing the project. And you should actually use that as a moment of awareness for yourself to say, oh, right, something must be going wrong here.
Yeah, in some sense, the students are always complaining if you go in a circle, and I'm like, we went in a circle. Awesome, we're doing the right thing. That's the recursive element. You come around again. You would come again and return and again. And you can do this because the object is fundamentally simple. That doesn't mean it's not complex, but that it holds itself. It gives itself to you in a simple sense, in a receivable way. By discursive, just real quickly, we mean something like, that's Eva Brand's sense, these kinds of things don't open themselves to strategic invasion. You actually get at them better if you futz around, which means that you don't try to get at it in this linear, progressive way. You don't kind of open it up like you're trying to dissect a frog step by step by step. You actually take the time to not know what you're doing because you're not trying to predict in advance how best to crack open this nut. You're trying to let the book lead you and guide you into it. In that sense, again, it's communal and dialectical. All these things, I'm just going to cut to the end of this part, all these things take time-taking, they take patience, they take courage, they take confidence, they take friends, they make friends in the search for it as well. Yes, it's so
right,
true.
so you have these freshmen who are really struggling with trying to get at it. Then you go to a group of sophomores or juniors, especially in seniors, you're like, oh, right, we're geniuses. Because it takes a while for them actually to get into the work. And so you've got to be patient with the way in which it returns. And it doesn't always return in what seemingly is a really profitable way. But over 4 years, what you start to see is like, people come in and they see our seniors, they're like, what are you guys doing? We're like, we're mostly geniuses. They see what we're doing with freshmen, and they're like, What is wrong with you people, right? And that's part of what we're saying is like, it's patience, right? Really, really patient.
I think just in closing, I think the benefit that we see here is inviting you to something that is rooted, that really defines a lot of how our human encounters work all the time, is that not only do you get better, obviously, at friendship, but you're encountering things that have an intrinsic worth that calls to people, that makes demands on people. And that once you do that, you're never the same. You never look at history the same. You never look at the life of an individual or an epoch or a people the same, because now each one of those things is an object that could invite the same kind of standing alongside to see something that is both shared and transformative.
And the last piece is what we were trying to do, even by the presentation of our paper and even the work on it, is to show you this in action, right? We actually worked for hours and hours in conversation about this and kept refining and wrestling with our ideas. And I know we got to places we could not have gotten on our own. And we're not done. Thank you.